Hello and welcome to another edition of Ideological. I am your host and the director of the Institute for the Study of Philosophy, Politics, and Culture in Dallas, Texas. My name is Zach Lee and I'm your guide for today. Today, we are talking about a very interesting and very important topic, what is called critical theory. What on earth is that? We're going to talk about this philosophical, sociological, political movement that really began in the 1930s and took off in the U.S. kind of in the 1960s, but most of us hadn't even heard about critical theory until, I don't know, maybe 2020. And so you're about 90 years behind the data, but we're going to be talking about critical theory. It is something that has influenced our culture a ton. In honor of critical theory, I'm going to be drinking a capitalistic, mass-produced German beer because they hated capitalism and they came out of Germany. So cheers. We're going to be combining, as the director of the Institute for the Study of Philosophy, Politics, and Culture, we're going to be combining all three of those things today. Philosophy, politics, and culture, because critical theory is a multi-layered kind of movement. So let me just explain to you real quickly the places you've probably heard about or been influenced by or seen critical theory, even if you didn't even know that term until today. The LGBTQ lobby is very much influenced by critical theory, as is transgenderism. The destruction of art, where people like throw paint or soup, on these pieces of art to destroy them, or the tearing down of statues, kind of some of that stuff is related to critical theory. Race-based ideologies, BLM, is explicitly linked to critical theory. In fact, there's kind of a subset of that called critical race theory. We're not dealing with that today, but that is linked to critical theory. Feminist-based ideologies are linked to critical theories. So the hashtag #MeToo movement and the hashtag #BelieveAllWomen movement and that kind of stuff is influenced by critical theory. The reemergence of Marxism, but from an identity politics standpoint. So people that are supportive of Marxism or certain types of socialism and communism that are not doing it for merely economic reasons, but rather maybe it's minority-based or it's racially based or it's based on one's sexuality or gender or something like that. That is something that comes to us from critical theory. Historical revisionism, forgetting that the past is very different than the way we think today and kind of whitewashing the past with different narratives to support your slant. DEI, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the workplace, in entertainment, in movies, etc. The canonization of less influential text in universities. So you used to get an education where you would read the greatest works in history. And by the greatest works, I mean the most influential. They're from great thinkers, whatever. Now, that is kind of verboten. And what you should do is just read these texts that have been marginalized, regardless of how intelligent they are or influential and that kind of stuff. There's algorithm bias, which is a result of critical theory. When you search for certain things will not come up because the powers that be want you to see their side of the story. Climate justice, attempts at a redistribution of wealth, it's all over the place, okay? So today, critical theory. Let's get critical. So it's going to be, we're going to talk about a kind of a heady movement, but it influences everything. So you need to pay attention. Be smart, right? Ideological. Be more smarter, something. I don't have a slogan yet, but be less dumb is a potential option, or be more smarter, or something funny like that. So hold on one second.
I'm so critical.
This episode, by the way, again, I'm trying to think somebody who would never sponsor. This episode, by the way, is brought to you by Blockbuster. Blockbuster. If you sneak a skin flick and sandwich it in between two regular movies, we won't notice. Blockbuster. Be kind. Rewind. So, just a piece of financial advice. Make sure to put all your money in Blockbuster. Just kidding. Don't do that. Don't sue me. That's not official financial advice. Let's talk about critical theory and why they're so influential. Let's first of all talk about where this school of thought comes from. It comes out of Germany. In 1930, Max Horkheimer became the director of the Institute of Social Research in Frankfurt, Germany at Goethe University. And this is going to be the institution that is going to produce this school. And by school, I mean it's a literal part of a school in Frankfurt, but it's also a school of thought. The Frankfurt School, or I'm going to say Frankfurt because I'm from Texas. But the Frankfurt School is going to be the group, and the men attached to that institution are going to be the ones who are going to influence culture for the next 100 years. It's still going, right? So it's been almost 100 years. It is strongly and explicitly Marxist. You need to understand that. There is no such thing as critical theory that is not far left-leaning. It is very Marxist, very much influenced by Hegel and Marx, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then the term critical theory comes to prominence in a very famous essay by Max Horkheimer called Traditional and Critical Theory. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between traditional theory and critical theory here in a second, but that work comes to prominence in 1937. So it comes out of Germany, 1930s. Almost all of these figures, if not all of them, are Jewish and they are German. A lot of them will end up moving to the U.S. after World War II or to escape certain German fascist idealisms and such. But imagine being a Jewish German as you start to see people like Hitler slowly rise to power. So that's the culture in which they live. Now, what is critical theory? This is a very complex, difficult topic, but I'm going to do my best to summarize. So, again, pay attention. It'll change your life. Impress your friends. Tell them about ideological, make me rich, whatever. So, it is a specific way of viewing humans and culture. So here's what it's trying to do. It's trying to critique the things around us and wake us up from the culture in which we live so we can see certain elements that are actually oppressing us. Let me say that again. Critical theory seeks to look at culture, modern capitalistic consumer culture, see how we got here, but also awaken us. Wake us up out of the matrix, if you want to say it that way, so that we see these forces going on which actually might not be for our good. They might not actually support human flourishing. That is a very generic, short definition, and I'm about to give you a really long definition. It is a total boner killer, but it's such a good definition. I made it up, so I think it's great. Let me wet my whistle, and then I will give you my definition.
I'm so critical.
Here's the definition of critical theory. You ready? It's long. It's difficult. It's hard.
That's what she said.
My definition is this: a philosophical and sociological movement that began in Frankfurt, Germany in the 1930s that believed. Now, let me give you these 6 points. We could add more points. We could take away some points. But if you understand these points, you'll understand what critical theory and the Frankfurt School are about. So what did these people believe? Here are the 6 points. 1, the overly rationalistic, objective, materialistic, and scientific worldview of the Enlightenment eventually caused humans to see other humans as objects over which they could exercise control, just as they had controlled nature. By the way, I'm going to elaborate on all these later in the lecture. Number 2, capitalistic consumer culture creates a society in which people are kept entertained so they don't realize that they are being used instrumentally as tools for those in power, and in which one's value is only found in the amount of money they can produce. Number 3, there are no essences or bare facts. Every so-called fact brings with it an entire worldview that creates a power structure of inequality. Number 4, cultural values change and merely reflect where one stands in an evolving historical process. Number 5, the theories of Hegel, Marx, Freud, and Nietzsche could be combined to better understand society, and through critical reflection, members of society could become aware of their oppression. And then number 6, critical theory is beyond critique, as anyone seeking to refute it is merely playing into the hands of the rationalistic status quo. Whoa, that is quite a definition. That was not just one sentence. That was more than one sentence. And so that is why critical theory is By the way, I'm supposed to say this because this is what's cool to do in academia. You're supposed to say there's no such thing as critical theory. There's just critical theories. There's no such thing as enlightenment. There's just enlightenments. They just say that. It's helpful actually to summarize things like this, even though obviously not everyone agrees with everything. I don't think that should be said, but you always have to say that or some professor will slap your hand. Okay, that's the movement. The movement is going to say the Enlightenment did some bad things to our culture and we can't really see it. So we need to be able to see it so that we can free ourselves from these systems of oppression that we think are not oppressing us, but they are. That's critical theory. Okay, that's a pretty good summary. A few things here. First of all, it has forerunners in both Hegel and Marx. Okay? Now, I'm going to do an entire lesson on Hegel. He's one of the most influential philosophers of all time. I'm going to do an entire lesson on Marx. He's the guy that's gotten the most people killed from his ideas in all time, throughout history. We're going to have separate lessons on both those guys eventually. But I just need to briefly summarize this. You can't briefly summarize Hegel. Hegel is a very difficult, impenetrable philosopher who wrote a lot. His most famous work is Phenomenology of Spirit. But let me just give you a quick summary of Hegel's thought, and then I'll just tell you what you have to remember. You don't have to remember the whole thing that I'm about to say. You ready? Hegel. His work traces the changing forms or shape of Geist. That's the word for spirit, by the way. And by that, he means God, the world, spirit, being. It's this. Anyway, God and the world are intimately linked, and both evolve over history as only God has the perspective of everything. An idea is posited, but eventually leads to a contradiction and a distinction between that idea and its negation. This then leads to a fuller new idea that encompasses both the original idea and its opposing idea. So God comes to greater self-realization over time through the interactions of history. So this is actually a pretty good definition. That sounds really nerdy and technical, but for Hegel, there is this Geist, this world spirit. He's kind of a panentheist. There's this all-encompassing, idea, knowledge, mind, and it evolves and comes to greater self-realization as history and our ideas and ideological systems evolve. So you might have heard it said this way, that there's a thesis put forward. Someone puts forward an idea. Then there's an antithesis. That's the contrary to that idea. And what happens is you get a new synthesis, and then that becomes the new thesis. Well, Hegel didn't use that kind of language. That comes from a guy named Fichte, but the idea is helpful. Here's what you need to remember. You don't need to remember any of that. That's just for me to show off. What you need to remember is this. Hegel, who's going to influence so many people. His thought is enormous. Whether you love him or hate him, he's a big deal. Hegel's system embraces logical contradiction. Systems previously, philosophers previous to Hegel, don't want contradictions. His system, in a sense, embraces contradiction. You think about something, you rationalize an idea, you find the contradictions, you now embrace that whole thing, and you start with a new idea. So that's going to be important. The second thing you need to remember is this. It means that you can't just say that there's this objective standard apart from history and development, right? Objective standards, if you even want to use that kind of phrase, which there's problems with using that, would change over time, change historically. Both of these are going to be very important for the critical theorist. The idea that contradiction is embraced, and the idea, like logical contradiction, the law of non-contradiction, and the idea that there's not just these objective things that we can view in the world, it's historically conditioned. Our culture is read onto whatever we're thinking about, talking about, interacting with, or with which we're interacting. Don't want to be naughty and end a sentence in a preposition, which I do all the time. Okay. That's Hegel. Marx, I'll keep it short. Marx, who some could argue doesn't really understand Hegel very well because Hegel's very idealistic. Ideologic. Marx is going to make this dependent upon material forces, right? Economic materialism is going to be the thing that actually progresses world history. So he's going to take Hegel and turn him upside down, whereas Hegel is, it's thought, it's idea, it's God, it's changing cultural ideas and these kind of things. For Marx, your ideas follow the economic stuff. Let me say it more clearly for Marx. You think the way you think because of the tax bracket into which you were born, okay? So economic things determine your ideas, but it's the economic stuff. What is it that makes man unique to Marx? It's that we produce labor. Beavers build dams and stuff, but we produce different kinds of labor and extra things and things we don't need. So that is what makes human life valuable. And so it's economic forces that actually change history and change classes and change ideologies. Okay. Slap yourself. Boring. Let's get through all this technical stuff, and then I'm going to summarize all this. We're going to have so much fun. I'm going to take my shirt off at some point. I'm not going to do that, but you'd keep watching, wouldn't you? Okay, so wink. All right, so let's contrast, since we're just trying to get our hands around critical theory, let's contrast it with traditional theory, okay? Coming out of the Enlightenment, here is how people viewed the world. Human nature is scientific and naturalistic, right? This is why when somebody has appendicitis, we don't do a sacrifice or pray or something like that. Usually we just go to the hospital, right? Humans are scientific and naturalistic. Human nature is also universal, okay? It's not historically conditioned, right? So it believes that there are certain truths that are true for all cultures. So every culture thinks that stealing is not just something you can do all the time. Every culture laughs when their kids do something funny. There are certain things that make us human. There's an essence of humanity, which we'll talk about in a second. That's traditional theory. It also believes that capitalism and universal rights and individual rights are very important. Okay, remember, the Enlightenment might be the single greatest thing for the practical benefit of humanity of all time. After the Enlightenment, we have science, we have technology, we have philosophies that are different than Aristotle. We have political rights. We elect our leaders. We have certain freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Those are all things coming out of the Enlightenment. Traditional theory. What is critical theory? You're going to see that critical theory is going to hold the opposite of just about all of those. Let me give you a definition. This comes from Fred Rush. He's a professor of philosophy at Notre Dame, Notre Dame, if you were French. Critical theory is critical just to the extent that it makes social inequality apparent, specifies some plausible candidates for the cause of the inequality, and enables society in general, or at least its oppressed segment, to react in appropriate ways. That's a pretty helpful summary of critical theory. Now, you might be asking throughout this lecture, how is this different than, say, postmodernism? You should listen to my postmodernism lecture, by the way. I think it's great. Critical theory and postmodernism share a lot in common. A lot. Here's the big distinguisher between the two, okay? The central difference between postmodernism and critical theory is that critical theory has a normative vantage point. Postmodern has no such vantage point, okay? You'll see this later on. With guys like Marx, he's still holding to certain types of rationalism. And so you're still creating a system to just replace an old system. Postmodernism is a little bit more cynical and acidic than that. So you'll find that this school of thought will draw from very different figures. Hegel and Marx, that we've already talked about briefly, but also Nietzsche. Now, that's really strange that it would draw from Nietzsche. These are interesting bedfellows, as they say. Again, bedfellows. Nietzsche will end up being quoted later by the Nazis, by a right-wing group, even though all these guys are very left-wing. What they like about Nietzsche, though, is he elevated aesthetics over reason. He was really concerned with people idolizing the state, right? So we just make the state a new idol. In Nietzsche's thinking, God has nothing to do. We've gotten rid of him. We've shown that he's ridiculous. He doesn't exist. So now we just take that worship and sometimes put it onto the state. And also Nietzsche likes the experts. He likes the elites. He likes the Übermensch, right? This self-actualized man that rises above others. He doesn't like what he calls mass man, right? So this everyone kind of group thinking together. And so that's why the critical theorist will like him. And then they take Freud, which is interesting, which we'll talk about, and his concept of repression, and they mix all that together, right? So if Hegel and Marx and some oppressed German Jews and Nietzsche and Freud all got together and had a baby, that baby would be critical theory. Okay. That kind of reminds me of several people having a baby, more than two. There's a great joke, which I think it's time to pause for a sip and a joke.
I'm so critical.
It's the Chuck Norris jokes. There's one that goes, it took 3 women 5 days to give birth to Chuck Norris. That's kind of the idea there. So, okay. Who are the major thinkers in critical theory? Hang with me a little bit longer, and then I will summarize all this stuff, okay? Who are the major thinkers? There's several of them, okay? Max Horkheimer, whom I've mentioned, Theodor Adorno, Friedrich Pollock, Erich Fromm, Siegfried Kracauer, Leo Lowenthal, and Herbert Marcuse, okay? Later, you'll get a very important figure that I'll mention just briefly, but he's a little more contemporary. His name is Jürgen Habermas. And then even later than that, there's a guy named Axel Honneth, who is, I think, actually over that Institute for Social Research today. So he's kind of the modern leader and thinker, maybe in critical theory. There's another guy, you might have heard this name, again, if you're a nerd like me, Walter Benjamin. He is a literary critic, but also has some critical theory elements in his thought. Okay. Whew. All right. Let's talk about their most famous work, and then we're going to summarize all of this. I'm going to give you a list at the end of some works if you wanted to start where you're like, hey, how can I start learning about critical theory? I'm going to give you some helpful primary materials and such. But let me just tell you about the most popular book within critical theory, and it's a book called Dialectic of Enlightenment. Okay, it's written by, again, Adorno and Horkheimer. Dialectic of Enlightenment, very, very, very important. It's a work that's really hard to read. This is intentional. If they're going to burn down the system and they're going to break us out of our conformity, they're not going to write like philosophers of the past. So their writing is obscure and weird intentionally. They're going to combine figures such as Odysseus and Homer's Odyssey. They're going to talk about Nietzsche. They're going to talk about the pornographic literature of Marquis de Sade. So it's a very odd read, but it's going to have a massive impact on culture. Here's the question they're asking. Zach, I'm confused. What are we talking about? You gave a definition. You said boner killer. Don't say that. You didn't tell me. You didn't give me a warning. My kid walked through the room, and I'm so sorry that they heard that. Here's what they're trying to ask in this book. What is the most educated, the most industrious, the most technologically advanced, super capitalistic, very much has embodied Enlightenment ideals, best universities? What nation has that in the 1930s and 1940s? It's Nazi Germany. Okay? Here's what they're asking. How can a country that is so advanced and so progressive and so smart, that has taken all the science and the philosophy and the politics and all these things, living after the Enlightenment, this might be the most powerful nation on earth. How could that turn into barbarism? How could that turn into maybe the worst thing that's ever happened? The killing of 6 million Jews, the concentration camps, the largest war in human history, or maybe the largest war in modern history. There's some debate depending on who you count. But that's a great question. You would think that if Germany was so educated, because they had the top universities at this time, the top scientists, all these kind of things, why didn't they make human life better? How could it turn into the absolute barbarity that it turned into with Hitler and the Third Reich and World War II and all that? That's the question that they're trying to ask, okay? Here's their answer kind of in summary form. Before the Enlightenment, you still have things that are mystical. You still have religion. You still have some things that we can't just quite dominate and master. Now, there's some oppression before the Enlightenment, right? Because the church and tradition and these kind of things they would see as oppressive. In the Enlightenment, though, you now get a new kind of myth, which is man, master of all things. We understand science. We can make crops grow better. We put everything under our thumb. Well, to the guys that are talking about critical theory, what they're going to say is, what you're doing is you're replacing an old type of oppression with a new type of oppression, that the Enlightenment becomes a new kind of myth and science becomes a new kind of myth, which is a way actually to oppress people. Let me say it another way. Subject and object should have mutual giving and taking. That's how relationships work. But today, everything is just an object. So as we become so scientifically advanced and we follow the Enlightenment to its logical end, we get rid of God, we get rid of what's mysterious. Humans just become another object to master. After all, what's the difference between a human and a monkey and a tree and these kind of things? If we're all just these material things, they're pretty similar. So here is the argument. I'm going to summarize it. I wrote this down just because the stuff can be complex, but I'm going to read from this, but my summary just then was just fine. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on science, reason, and the unlimited human potential, caused us to view all of life as under our control. We were the masters over everything. Over time, this also causes us, especially the elites, to see humans as just another object in nature, just another number. This leads to treating humans as objects and dissolves the subject-object interplay between people. It leads to everything being a material variable. Whew, okay. Take a break. Go get you a Red Bull. Go get you a Monster energy drink or something. Go lean into your capitalism and buy these things that are mass-produced to oppress you, according to the critical theorist. Now, you've hung in through all the technical stuff. There's still going to be more technical stuff, but I'm just going to try to summarize the main points, some of the language that they use, and then the problems with it. You ready? You're doing great. Proud of you. Really proud of you. Especially you, Kyle. I'm just sure that, or Kevin. There's somebody named Kevin or Kyle watching this. Hey. Your dad's not proud of you, but I am. Major concepts. Number one of critical theory, anti-essentialism. What is essentialism? Essentialism is the idea that things have a preset essence. An easier way to think of an essence is a definition. A human is a human regardless of your society or your history or what you think about it. It has an essence. That's a traditional view. Critical theory does not believe in essentialism. Humans don't have an essence. They don't have something that is it is what it is to make them a human. All these things are made by culture. Culture takes their biases and presuppositions and the historical epoch in which they live, and they read it onto things. And so man doesn't come preset man is made through culture's view of him. Okay, that's the idea of anti-essentialism, which is all throughout critical theory. This is why I said they don't think there's any such thing as bare facts. Bare facts means that things are objective and everybody could come to that conclusion, and that oppresses people because it puts them under the irrationalism and the science of the Enlightenment. So instead, these facts are made. When you engage with a fact, you alter it because you read your biases onto it. Number 2, Marxism. They love them some Marxism, okay? Now, there are some people within the critical theory camp that will critique certain elements of Marxism, right? So Habermas, for example, would critique Marx because Marx's worldview is still objective. You still have a subject-centered rationality, just like in the Enlightenment. So eventually with critical theory, your friends become your enemies. But they are strongly and vehemently Marxist in what they want to do. Now, some of them, again, it depends on the theorist. Some of them would agree more with Marx, with the economic side being the most foundational. Others try to do what's called Western Marxism, where they're trying to take Marx without the gulag. They're trying to take Marx but not have to have violent revolution. They're going to try to institute it ideologically. Oh, what? That's not real Marxism, by the way. Again, Marx's whole theory has to go together. When you change it, you're breaking it. Anyway, so keep that in mind. Marxism is huge. Freudianism. This is, again, a strange bedfellow with Marx. The Frankfurt School was actually the first school to link, the first kind of school of thought is what I mean, to link Freud and Marx. They kind of used Freud to make up for the sterile materialism of Marx. In fact, the Frankfurt Psychoanalytic Institute shared a building with the Institute of Social Research there. And so there was a lot of go-between here. The problem with linking critical theory with Freud, and they link them with Freud strongly. I don't know how aware they are of their contradictions, but again, that's too essentialist. The problem with Freud's view is that human nature is more or less objective, right? It's not just culturally determined like that. He was also pessimistic that human nature could actually change. We just have these dark the forces that we repress. For Freud, we repress our desires. So again, I'll do a whole lesson on Freud at some point. For Freud, we want to fight people, kill people, sleep with all the people that we find attractive. And they're these dark, very primal biological desires. Now, if we acted on those, the world would be chaos. So we suppress them. We repress them. We push them down. And they come out, though, in ways that are more socially acceptable. So instead of killing somebody and having sex with their girlfriend, you play football. It's a socially accepted form of aggression. Or instead of just having sex with whoever you want, you write poetry. You pour that energy, that pent-up sexual energy, into some other thing that's more culturally acceptable. Okay, this idea of repression is going to be used by the critical theorist, especially Herbert Marcuse, and then another guy that we won't talk a ton about, but a guy named Wilhelm Reich. And what they're going to say what repression does is it perpetuates the status quo. We suppress our desires, we suppress our sexuality. That causes us to save it for monogamous marriage, which produces normal nuclear families, and that just produces more workers for the system and teaches them the same values that were there previously. They're trying to destroy all that. This is why there's such an attack today on the nuclear family. Instead of having one mommy that's a female biologically and one daddy that's a male biologically and kids, you have all these different views of what the family can be. This is intentional. This is from critical theory. And they, when you have the nuclear family, you get the status quo, and they don't want that. They do. It's not an exaggeration to say critical theory wants to start it all from scratch and start over. This is why so many Marxist movements, by the way, after the Marxist leader comes to power, that becomes year zero. You start it over. It doesn't matter what came before us. We need to be unburdened from that, and we need to start with a new system. Number 4, this is important. There is no solution. So if you ask the critical theorist, okay, great, I hear your critiques. How do we change it? What's the goal? They will say, of their own accord, there is no solution. Marcuse was more of a radical, and Habermas tried to implement certain forms of democracy to change the system, but Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse thought that this just led to another playing in the system with which they disagree, right? So if they say there's no essentialism, and then they say, we're going to try to change the system, you're just going to create a new type of essentialism. You're going to just create a new historically conditioned system. And so what they want to do in their politics is what they call engaged withdrawal. Their goal is to bitch and moan and complain about the things they don't like and let that awaken people, and maybe that will bring about something good. But there's not kind of the end to the plan, okay? Let me give you a quote, actually, from Marcuse, from One Dimensional Man. He says this: "The critical theory of society possesses no concepts which could bridge the gap between the present and its future. Holding no promise and showing no success, it remains negative." Again, I'm not making this up when I say they don't have a solution. This is their words. "Thus, it wants to remain loyal to those who, without hope, have given and give their life to the great refusal." Okay? It's a negative critique. It doesn't have a system with which to replace it. Again, some guys try to have some of those things, but that's not original mainstream Frankfurt School stuff. Number 5, humans are merely a cog in the machine. They are valued only for what they can produce in a capitalistic economy. They are interchangeable. Okay, listen up, slap yourself, stay awake, pay attention to this. This is important. Within a capitalistic system, after the Enlightenment, when everything is material, including humans, physical, humans are interchangeable. They don't have intrinsic value. Again, Marx thought what made us valuable was our labor. That's what makes us different than animals. Again, ants build, mounds, and bees make hives, but we make iPhones and such. So that's what makes us valuable. But now, in a capitalistic society, especially the type in which is going on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that doesn't matter. Like you're separate from your labor. It's the factory owner that owns the thing that makes you human, that owns your labor. And so you get what? You're just valuable for what you can produce monetarily, right? Let me say it this way. This is a very simple way to think about it. Let's say that there's an assembly line at a factory, and there's 100 workers there, and one of the guys gets cancer. The factory owner does not give a flying blah. They don't care. He'll die. Great. There's 10 people waiting for his job. We'll just throw another cog in the machine. That person doesn't have value. We don't go to him and say, "Oh, we're so sorry. We need to pay you more. Sorry you got cancer," etc. You're just part of the machine that we haven't figured out how to, make robotic yet. So your value is only in the money that you can produce. People are completely interchangeable. Remember, money doesn't have intrinsic value. It has what Marx would call exchange value. It doesn't have use value. You prefer a bottle of water in a desert to a brick of gold. And so maybe another example. Let me give you another example. Think of the prevalence of pornography in our culture. Nobody cares about that porn star. She's just a naked body that can be exchanged for another naked body, right? Like nobody cares, if she had a bad upbringing. Nobody cares if she has some disease. Like she's just someone on a screen, and then when she's boring, there's somebody else, right? She's just interchangeable. It's just a cog. And so we could use an analogy from Hegel if we wanted to. Hegel has this story this explication of the idea of a lord and a bondservant. Now, you would think that the Lord is just the important one there, but you actually need that relationship between the Lord and the bondservant. You need that interplay. Here's what I mean. Though the Lord is an aristocrat and he has money and land and all these kind of things, it's the bondservant who makes him his meals and cleans his clothes and does these things. And if the bondservant dies one day, the Lord needed that bondservant who actually had the power. And so, to quote Dialectic of Enlightenment, animism had endowed things with souls. Industrialism makes souls into things. Or another quote from Dialectic of Enlightenment, "Who dies is unimportant. What matters is the ratio of incidences of death to the liabilities of the company." We put a cash value, literally, on people's lives, right? It's the idea where, let's say there's a car manufacturer and there's some recall. They know that 1 out of every 1,000 cars is going to blow up. Well, if that's going to cost them $10 million to do the recall, but if they don't do the recall and people die, it only costs them $7 million in court costs, then they're not going to do the recall because they saved $3 million. People's lives, we put a numeric value on. That's why when somebody is killed or whatever, people pay reparations. We're literally saying humans can be exchanged for paper money. Number 6, capitalistic culture. Entertainment, technology, fashion, mass-produced art, they talk a lot about that, trap us in needing its products and also distract us from the fact that we are part of the system. Okay? Let me give you an example. Does email make our lives easier or more difficult? It originally made our lives easier. You didn't have to walk to the mailbox or go to the post office to send a letter, and it got there instantly. But now most of our job, like whatever job you do, probably most of it is answering emails. It was supposed to help us, but now we're kind of a slave to the system. Or your smartphone. That should be something that makes your life easier. And in some ways it does, but in other ways, you're always on. There's no work-life balance. Your employer can call you. You get emails of all times of the day. People comment on social media and you got to respond because you just have to. Do they enslave us? That's kind of the idea that they are pointing out. I'll give you an example here. This also comes from Dialectic of Enlightenment. Let me give you a great quote. The culture industry has sardonically realized man's species being. Everyone amounts only to those qualities by which he or she can replace everyone else. All are fungible, mere specimens. As individuals, they are absolutely replaceable, pure nothingness, and are made aware of this as soon as time deprives them of their sameness. Whoa, okay? So this is kind of the idea behind the consumer culture owning us. Number 7, people support powerful revolutionary causes like fascism because they have suppressed their guilt and become stupid. How could Nazi Germany, or Germany before the Nazis, that had a large working class, that had, very advanced education, science, technology, how could they support someone like Hitler? Well, one, they feel guilty. Wilhelm Reich says this. He thinks that repressed sexuality leads to the normal nuclear family that continues the status quo. And so we have these sexual desires that are dark. We push them down. And so we feel guilty. And so we want to follow a strong leader who doesn't make us feel so guilty. There's a lot of psychology going on here. So that's one reason why people followed Hitler. He was a strong leader, even though he was terrible as a person. Also, capitalistic culture involves groupthink. It makes everyone stupid. It makes people sheeple. It makes people into sheep. This is true of the right or the left, by the way. It's true of the far right. So let me say it this way. You should always critique everything that you hear politically. You should always critique your party. You should always critique thoughts. Don't just absorb things. Be critical. But you'll see this on the far right, where Donald Trump can do no wrong. Whether you love him or hate him, that's not my point. My point is, for some people, he can do no wrong. Whatever he says, they get off their knees and they wipe their chin and they say, yes, sir. But the left also does this. Think of what happened. Think of the groupthink that happened with COVID. Think about the groupthink that happened like after George Floyd, where everybody put a square on their social media post and like they defunded the police. Or think about like in June, how your employer says you better put a rainbow flag in your signature line. And everyone again. And then the left also gets off their knees, wipes their chin and says, yes, sir. Stop doing that. Be critical. Don't be stupid. Stop following the masses. Stop doing everything because other people are doing it. Think. Because a lot of times when you follow the masses, you end up with the Nazis or you end up with Hitler, Stalin or something like that. So don't do that. Be a critical thinker. Be an objective thinker. Okay, let's talk about some terms in jargon that is used in critical theory. Number 1, transfiguration. Moving goodness and human flourishing that could be achieved in this life to the next life. That's what they mean by transfiguration. Instead of enacting change now, you just wait for this future hope of heaven. There you'll be vindicated. There things will be good. And it causes you to be lazy now and not support the change that you need to support. Ideology or ideology. Here's what they mean by this. It means a little different than just a worldview, which is kind of what it means for our show. But the system of beliefs and values in a culture that distract them from the fact that they're actually under other people's power structures. That's what ideology or ideology means. Let me give you an example of this. They would say, and Marx actually would agree with this even before the critical theorist, religion does that. It's an ideology that causes you to not care about what's going on here because the focus is all on the next life. Well, that leads to you not pushing back what's evil now. Okay, this is actually going on right now in a lot of religious spheres, Catholic and Protestant. There are a lot of religious leaders that say something like this. Stop caring so much about politics. Stop caring about my tribe and your tribe, or my party and your party, or my flag and your flag. That's building a kingdom here on earth. Our kingdom's in heaven. Let's focus on that. Here's really what those people are saying. They're saying, don't care about helping people this side of eternity. You have the opportunity. You have the ability to make people's lives better, to get people out of oppression, to keep people from getting killed, to have people live better, flourishing lives. Stop doing that. That's politics. Just focus on the next life. The critical theorists are like, yeah, that keeps you from doing anything good this side of eternity. Okay, so that's an ideology. An ideology is ideas that we hold that don't actually serve our interest. They don't serve the interest of those that hold those ideas. False consciousness. It's a phrase you'll get in critical theory. What that means is the oppressed class doesn't realize that they are oppressed. They have a consciousness, but it's false. They're misled. They don't understand what's going on, though they think that they do. Alienation. This is a big one. You get alienation in a lot of postmodern thinkers. You get it in Marx. You get it in Freud. Alienation is this sense of separation that one feels from themselves when you don't quite feel yourself. Now, for Marx, it's based on labor. When you don't own your labor, that's the thing that literally gave you value as a human, so you feel alienated. For Freud, there's this idea of sexual repression makes you feel alienated and can lead to psychosis and some other problems. Today, alienation is used for anything that makes someone feel like they're not fully, truly, and freely themselves. Okay? So it has more of a psychological element that something feels off. I feel separate from me. I don't really feel like me. When somebody says something like that, I don't really feel like me. You see this in the transgender movement, which has embraced a lot of elements of critical theory, where you feel like the opposite biological sex than what you are. That's part of critical theory. Okay, mimesis is the attempt to control nature by something in that nature. Let me give you a definition of this. This comes from Julian Roberts, who's a professor of philosophy at the University of Munich. Mimesis is the assimilation of consciousness to reality. Okay. Some people say mimesis, but it's usually pronounced mimesis. Let me give you an example of this. Back in the day, if you were a witch doctor and you wanted it to rain, you might take some water, and what you're doing is you're trying to control culture, control nature by taking this thing and kind of, giving it this power. It's the attempt to control nature by something in that nature. So you might try to use water, or with sacrifices, people would manipulate blood. That's a type of mimesis. Another great example of this is gargoyles on cathedrals. Part of the reason, sometimes they're just water spouts and they're aesthetically interesting, but part of the reason that gargoyles were put on all these churches is the idea was they look scary and like demons, and it scares away the bad demons, right? They're kind of like, hey, demons, don't come here. We've already got demons and we're bigger and badder than you, so stay away. This house is already inhabited by gargoyle demons, so you guys stay away. That's a type of similar idea. Reification, you'll hear this term a lot in critical theory, reification. The word reification just means to make something concrete or actualized. How it's used in critical theory is this: when one considers reality and power, or one ascribes reality and power to things that are really social relations. What does that mean? Money is a great example of this. Money is a great example of this, reification. It's just this thing that doesn't have value, but value is ascribed to it, power is ascribed to it because of what it can do in social relations. It buys things, goods and services, etc. Or here's maybe another great example, likes on social media. Likes on social media don't technically mean anything, they're just a click. They give power, though, they empower this idea of social influence. And so that is a type of reification. And I'll give you one more. There's more, but these are the big ones. Repressive tolerance. What is repressive tolerance? Listen to this. Why are so many universities pushing to have speech codes, to try to get rid of the First Amendment, all these kind of crazy, very totalitarian things? It's because of an idea called repressive tolerance. What is repressive tolerance? It's a restriction on freedom of speech so that the status quo cannot continue. If you give everyone freedom of speech, they're going to push different ideas. That's the Enlightenment. We have differing ideas and we're tolerant and we listen to ideas, and whoever has the best logical idea wins. Well, if you do that, you're going to get the society that we have now. We don't want to do that. We want to burn society to the ground. We want to start over with a new society. So you have to not have tolerance. You have repressive tolerance. You don't want that kind of tolerance because then people might not follow your critical theory. They might follow a different idea. You can't have that. You need to dominate them mentally. You don't need to allow them to have that much freedom. And so I'm not making this up. This is not me being some sort of like anti-critical theory grinding an axe. This is the view. Let me give you a quote from Herbert Marcuse on his article, Repressive Tolerance. He says this: they would include the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly. So he's talking about taking away freedom of speech and freedom of assembly from groups and movements which promote aggressive policies, armament, chauvinism, discrimination on the grounds of race and religion, or which oppose the extension of public services, social security, medical care, etc. So take away the rights of everyone that's not a leftist. That's what he's saying. Okay? That is their view. Now, almost done. Whew. I would have last drink. It's almost gone. Done in honor of, I don't want to in honor of critical theory. Some parts of it are stupid. in honor of Blockbuster. I'm sorry that you're dead. There used to be a great account online. I don't know if it's still there anymore. It was a social media account called The Last Blockbuster. And they would just say hilarious things. They'd say things like, stop sending me pictures of closed Blockbusters. I don't send you pictures of your dead relatives. They'd say things like that. It was pretty funny. So anyway, cheers to Blockbuster.
I'm so critical.
Let's talk about some problems with critical theory. Number one, I think this is the biggest problem. Critical theory is non-falsifiable. Anything you would use to prove that it's wrong, they'll just say, that's part of the system. They start with the very thing that they should be proving. It's a circle jerk. It's a circular argument that is not falsifiable, right? To use the term from Karl Popper, you need, for something to actually be intelligent, you need it to be falsifiable. There has to be something you could show it or show that person that they would say, okay, I'm wrong. You don't have that with critical theory. Any objection you give, they just say that's not part of our system. Anything that doesn't agree with me is wrong, right? It's a conspiracy theory. So let's go over conspiracy. Here's what makes a conspiracy theory. And again, there are right-wing and left-wing conspiracy theories. A conspiracy theory, what makes a conspiracy theory is that it's not falsifiable. Someone that's a flat earther that thinks the world is flat instead of a sphere, it's a sphere, by the way, no matter what evidence you give them, they can't discern good and bad evidence. Anything that goes against their system, they'll just try to explain away. Well, the Earth looks like that because the mirrors and the pilots are all in on this and the government's in on it, and it's just not falsifiable. There's nothing you could show them that would disprove them. There's also left-leaning conspiracy theories like critical theory. Nothing you could show them would cause them to say, I'm wrong. Number two, listen to this one. This is the biggest critique that's usually leveled against them. I think number one's the biggest critique, but this one is the one that's usually leveled against them. The critical theorist does the same thing they are accusing capitalism of doing, using reason and reading their biases onto others. So if there's not essentialism, if there's not these objective, bare facts, then that just means you replace an Enlightenment view, which reads a worldview onto an entire society, with your view that reads a worldview onto an entire society. It's the same thing. Beatrice Hansen, who's a professor at both Harvard and University of Georgia, says this: Horkheimer and Adorno remained trapped in a performative contradiction. Their skepticism hollowed out the very foundations of reason, while they still adhered to rational tools with which they implemented their critique of reason. Okay, it's a great, pungent, precise quote that shows the self-contradiction of this worldview. For example, they would say, hey, the capitalistic system turns people into just dollars. They're completely interchangeable. Who cares if a factory worker is switched out for another factory worker? They're just dollars. And you say, no, they're not. People are people. They're not just dollars. They have lives, they have emotions, they have families, they have value that's not based on dollars. And then someone says, I think we should pay reparations. And you're like, wait, you've just turned people back into dollars again. So you don't understand how pervasive these kind of things are. Number three, critical theory, ironically, objectifies and dismisses people. So what they're saying is the capitalistic system, the Enlightenment system, has objectified people and has just written them off. Like when you use the word slave or when you use the word factory worker, these are just a category of people. It doesn't actually involve any individual people. It's a way to silence their voice, to suppress them. But they do the same thing when they call somebody white, heteronormative, male, cisgendered, something like that. They're just using these broad social categories so that you don't see them as people. They're doing the same damn thing, okay? Number four, appearance is the opposite of reality. That's another problem with critical theory. They're going to say that appearance is actually the opposite of how you view the world is actually the opposite of the way that you are viewing it. So to use a postmodern term, they're trying to gaslight everybody, okay? They're trying to gaslight everybody. What they're saying is all the social advantages that we have are actually bad and actually enslave us. Marcuse is very explicit about this. So what they're going to say is, you go to this job, you have your phone, you get married, you vote a certain way, and you're actually a slave to the system, and all this is actually bad. Despite the fact that we have hospitals, despite the fact that we have technology, despite the fact that we have more political freedoms than we've ever had, despite all that, you're actually a slave. It's a hard case to make, but that's the case that they make. It's kind of like if you've ever read Brave New World. It's this society where the government kind of tries to pacify everybody to keep them complacent. So they actually encourage them to have a lot of sex, which we would think is a freedom. They encourage them to take drugs. I can't remember the name of the drug. I think it's something like Soma. And they encourage them to sex, drugs, and rock and roll because it pacifies them and doesn't let them see what the government's doing. You kind of get that element in critical theory. That might be a helpful analogy to use for what they're saying. And then number 5, critical theory has no solution. Critical theory has no solution. Someone like Habermas makes other critical theorists mad because he wants to retain some elements from the Enlightenment, some good things, cultural discourse and democracy and the chance to chat. But most critical theorists don't think you can do that. It's just meant to be negative, complaining, to awaken people to it. What's your solution? Well, I don't really have a better system, but anything's got to be better than capitalism. My solution's kind of Marxist, but we can't actually get there because that's essentialism. That's still rationalistic objectivity. That's critical theory. Okay, what do you think of critical theory? Smart, good, bad, dumb? Post your comments. If you can't, then retweet, put it on social media, repost, gram, whatever. This is recorded in 2025. Whatever you have when you're watching this video, post it on that. Okay. Let's talk about where should you get started? Zach, this was so interesting. Thank you so much for taking up so much of your time to study, to teach me critical theory. You're welcome. Kevin? We had Kyle, now we have Kevin. You're welcome, Kevin. I did it for you. And there's another, I'm sure there's somebody younger out there. There's some 18-year-old kid who's just getting into philosophy, and because he's 18, he's got a weird name like Sequoia or something. Keep going, Sequoia. Use your brain. Okay. Major works. Where do you start? There's so much written on critical theory and by critical theorists. Where should you start? Well, I'm a big primary sources guy. So the places you should start. So there is an article called Traditional and Critical Theory by Horkheimer, which I would highly recommend. That's a great starting point. It's, I don't know, it's like 65 pages. You can get it online for free. It's pretty easy. Minima Moralia by Adorno is one that you need to read. Dialectic of Enlightenment, which I've already mentioned. That's kind of the standard starter. One-Dimensional Man by Marcuse, also very, very popular, very influential. His one on sex and how sex is repressive and leads to status quo is called Eros and Civilization. Some people say Eros, but it's an omicron, not an omega, so it's Eros. That's also by Marcuse. And if you want something from Habermas, I'd recommend Knowledge and Human Interests. Okay. Now, Zach, I'm not going to do that. That's too much reading. Those guys are hard to read. Do you have something that is an easier summary? Sure. If you want to be a loser and have just secondary literature, fine. A few helpful things. I'll give you 2. There's more than this, but 2. The Cambridge Companion to Critical Theory is pretty helpful. It's a collection of essays by different scholars on different aspects of critical theory. And then this came out a few months ago. This is the easiest introduction, probably. It's called To Change All Worlds, Critical Theory from Marx to Marcuse. It's short. It's about 250 pages. It's written from a religious perspective, which I wish it was a little more not biased, but it's a great summary of critical theory in layman's terms. So it'd be a good starting point if this is new to you and you want to learn more about it. Thanks for being here. Critical theory, learn it, know about it, whether you love it or hate it. That's what it is. Thank you for tuning in to perhaps the greatest podcast. I don't want to boast. I want to be humble. But like Joe Rogan texted me recently and he's like, hey, your podcast's way better than mine. Yeah, I've got like millions of more followers, but like, I don't know what critical theory is. And, I'm not as a great stand-up comedian. And I was like, that's fine, dude. Yeah, I loved you on Fear Factor and love you on, announcing UFC. You got some good jokes and your podcast is very interesting. So, we're like BFFs. So don't tell him that. He doesn't know who I am. So, all right. Thanks so much for tuning in and we will catch you next time.